would it feel not to be able to vote simply because of who you are? Hello, my name is Jennifer Hurl, and I work as the archivist here at our Meyersdale Public Library in Meyersdale, Pennsylvania. Up until the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, women here in Pennsylvania and in most other states across our nation were faced with just that, not being able to visit the polls and cast their votes on Election Day simply because they were women. Their struggle was a long one, beginning in 1848 with the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. The Library of Congress has referred to the women's suffrage movement as the largest reform movement in American history. It was a struggle that would last 72 years. We've probably all heard of the famous suffragists. Women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, and later Alice Paul and Ida B. Wells. But what about those women who worked for the cause from small communities just like this one here in Meyersdale? They were a part of this movement too, a struggle that would take over 7 decades. Little did our Meyersdale Library know when we undertook a historical newspaper preservation project in 2018 where that project would lead. We had 2 small collections, scattered issues of old community newspapers, saved by a former librarian, Marguerite Cockley, and ensured that they would get to our library by her granddaughter. Those newspapers were filmed and digitized through a project we undertook, and it led to the discovery of a previously unknown local history story and a community-wide effort to share that story. If you'd like to know more, step inside with me and we'll begin to tell you all about it. Our Meyersdale Public Library's Pennsylvania room has always been dedicated to preserving our local history and its stories. Back in 2018, we discovered we had 2 collections of scattered issues of some local newspapers dating back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, but we had them available as hard copies only. So we embarked on a historical newspaper preservation project aimed at both filming and digitizing these newspaper collections. Little did we know what that project would lead to.
Hi, I'm Linda. I volunteer here in the Pennsylvania room at Meyersdale Library. And when the microfilm came back from the company who put the hard copy into microfilm, Jennifer asked me if I would look over it for mistakes, which we did find some. This, by the way, is a microfilm reader, for those who might not know. And one of the first things that my eyes fell on was a short notice in the Meyersdale commercial in 1913 of the first suffrage meeting here. And so Jennifer's behind me at the time. We talked back and forth. And she said, oh, next year is the 100th anniversary. If you find anything more on suffrage, print it. So almost every newspaper, every front page, I found another article on suffrage. And it was quite interesting. And she's reading them behind me as I'm turning the pages. And I heard a name pop up. I said, oh, I know them. I don't really know them. They've been dead for 100 years. But it was the Kernans in Somerset. I walk a lot of cemeteries, so I was familiar with their plot.
Ultimately, our newspapers that we previously had available as hard copies only ended up in the Pennsylvania Newspaper Archive, digitized and freely accessible to anyone who would like to view them. So this is the archive, and as you can see, here is once again the story on the first suffrage meeting here in Meyersdale, Pennsylvania.
Earlier that month, there had been a large women's suffrage parade in our nation's capital, so obviously Meyersdale's women didn't wait long before joining the national movement. Flora Snyder Black was elected the first president of that first women's suffrage club here in Meyersdale. Flora was no stranger to us. She's a popular woman here in the Meyersdale area because she was the founder of the Society of Farm Women of Pennsylvania. These photographs of Flora were shared with our Meyersdale Public Library by her grandson Frank, his wife Barbara, and her granddaughter Rebecca. Linda mentioned earlier she was familiar with the Kernan surname here in Somerset County. When we discovered the name Alice Kernan, who you may have noticed presided over that first suffrage meeting here in Meyersdale, we delved into our collection of family files here at the Meyersdale Public Library and discovered Alice had been laid to rest in Somerset's Union Cemetery. Linda wasted no time in taking a trip to that cemetery and attempting to locate Alice's tombstone. Ironically, one of the first stones she uncovered on that snowy day in the late winter, early spring of 2019 was that of our new friend, Alice Paisley Flack Kernan. Along with friends representing a local Daughters of the American Revolution chapter and Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War camp, Linda began working to clean up the Kernan family plot. We later planted flowers, and by springtime, our friend Alice was no longer forgotten. We did the same at Flora's tombstone. She had been laid to rest here in Meyersdale's Union Cemetery.
The great majority of women will always prefer the home life, but the exceptional woman should be perfectly free to do whatever kind of work in the world God has fitted her for, be it teacher, artist, doctor, lawyer, minister, mayor, school director, governor, or president. This quote was delivered by Alice Paisley Flack Kernan in the year 1913, right here in Meyersdale, Pennsylvania. A very progressive quote for the time period. So who was Alice? Alice Kernan was born in 1870 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She would come to marry Somerset Area Attorney Edmund E. Kernan, and in 1908 the two would build a home just outside of Somerset. Alice was instrumental in the organization of the parent-teacher organization here in Somerset County. She would eventually serve as the president of the State Teachers Association and eventually would speak overseas as a member of the State Council on Education. In a book we have in our library, published by the Somerset County Seroptimists, it's stated about Alice. Mrs. Kernan was a born leader for women's rights, not the strident type, but the educated, staunch type, who believed that female brains should be used and recognized. Alice led a meeting right here at the old high school building in Meyersdale in December of 1913. When she visited Meyersdale from Somerset to lead that meeting, she stayed with Meyersdale Area Suffragist Louise Icefeller Livengood, who was the wife of Meyersdale Republican newspaper editor and publisher William Livengood. Louise would later become the second president of Meyersdale's suffrage organization. An interesting note about this building is that it was once housed our Meyersdale Public Library around the 1980s for a few years before we moved to our new home in 1984. but our Meyersdale area suffragists met here on a regular basis beginning in 1913. On February 5th of 1914, Flora Snyder Black led a local suffrage meeting in this building, and Pittsburgh suffragist leader Mrs. Frank Rossing spoke at that meeting. A week later, on February 13th, 1914, the Berlin Record newspaper would report on the first women's suffrage meeting being held in Berlin. That meeting was held earlier in the day on February 5th, that afternoon, and Alice presided over it. As the newspaper reported, the meeting at Berlin's Pastime Theater was attended by about 50 prominent female leaders of the town. And the story made special note that by the time Mrs. Kernan had finished her address, all were enthusiastic about women's suffrage.
As we dug deeper and deeper into our research, we came to learn Alice Paisley Flack Kernan, a name previously unknown to us, had made quite a few headlines during that time. She even served as an office holder in the Pennsylvania Woman Suffrage Association. This was a woman who knew how to lead, and we were just beginning to discover her story. Though we unfortunately have no identification in regard to this photograph taken outside of Meyersdale's Methodist Episcopal Church, we feel there is a real possibility the woman pictured in the center of the photograph, in the dark dress, holding her skirt, could very well be our Alice Kernan. We believe this could have been a photograph taken as a local suffragist meeting was dispersing for the evening.
The reasons why women should have equal suffrage with man in a government of, for, and by the people are so obvious that it seems a waste of time and energy to reiterate them. Women certainly are an integral part of the people, and a very large part, an important part at that. Government is for them, as well as for the rest of the people, and therefore they should have a voice in the government as well as men. If we are to have a government by, as well as of, and for the people. That's a quote from the Meyersdale Republican newspaper in the spring of 1915, when women here in the Meyersdale community met in our Methodist Episcopal Church. Flora Snyder Black and a number of members of her family attended church here and were active members. So it would stand to reason that they would choose this site as yet another place to hold their meetings. Keep in mind 1915 was a big year for the suffrage movement here in Pennsylvania, as it would be that November when men would visit the polls and cast their votes regarding a state amendment that had the potential to give women the vote here in Pennsylvania. So, as you saw in one of our slides, this was yet another site where our local suffragists would meet, and Alice was in this building too, where during one of those springtime 1915 meetings, she spoke to several dozen women and several men inside this church's Sunday school room. Both Meyersdale newspapers, the Republican and the Commercial, covered the event, with the Meyersdale Republican calling Alice one of Somerset County's most accomplished, earnest, pleasing, and convincing publicists who presented the subject of women's suffrage in a very plain, forceful, and common sense manner. That same week, she would also speak in both Salisbury and Bedford on the topic of women's suffrage. Now keep in mind, all women weren't for suffrage. As hard as that may be for us today here in 2021 to comprehend, there were a large number of women themselves who felt that giving women the vote would be the beginning of the end. So on the same day that Alice visited here in May of 1915, and spoke to a group of suffragists, there was actually a representative of the Anti-Woman Suffrage Association here in Meyersdale as well. And that continued on here in our community and throughout Somerset County. The Meyersdale Republican had actually reported, and the commercial did as well, that September of 1915 on a anti-suffrage meeting a few streets over from us here at a North Street home. But 1915 was probably, could arguably have been the busiest year, perhaps, for suffrage here in Somerset County because of that state amendment that would be on the ballot that November. There were even here throughout Pennsylvania suffrage gardens, and the suffrage organization at the state level had developed little seed packets filled with yellow, purple, and white suffrage flower seeds. And those seed packets were sold to women across Pennsylvania, not only to raise money for the cause, but also as a way for them to plant these gardens and show their support for suffrage. There was also a 6-county suffrage rally at Alice's home that June, and some 200 women from Bedford, Blair, Cambria, Fayette, Huntington, and Somerset counties attended the rally. We'll hear more about a rally at Alice's house a little further down the line in our presentation, but that was another key site here in the county. It was just located outside of Somerset, not here in Meyersdale. Another huge part of the movement in 1915 is the story of the Women's Justice Bell. And we learned a lot through this project about the bell and its time it spent here in Somerset County. And we'll tell you more about that as well.
This schedule, as printed in the Meyersdale Republican newspaper on the 29th of July, 1915, outlines the route the Justice Bell was to take here through Somerset County. Beginning in the northernmost community here in our county, and over the next 2 days, traveling southward through many small towns, eventually spending some time in our county seat, Somerset, and then traveling southward through the communities of Rockwood, Garrett, Meyersdale, and eventually Berlin. We were especially excited when Linda discovered this photograph, kept in a scrapbook of the Bell's travels throughout Pennsylvania during the summer of 1915, and taken in front of our Somerset County Courthouse. We soon learned that while the Justice Bell was originally slated to arrive here in Meyersdale on July 31st, the truck carrying the bell had broken down and had to be repaired. Therefore, the bell spent an extra night in front of the Somerset County Courthouse. In spite of this, a crowd of some 500 people, joined by residents of the nearby Salisbury community, turned out in Meyersdale to celebrate all the same. The Justice Bell at last arrived in Meyersdale on Monday, August 2nd. Of interesting note in regard to the bell is that its clapper was dampened as it journeyed throughout the state of Pennsylvania. The suffragists who accompanied the bell had no intentions of ringing it until at last the women of our state had gained the vote. The week after the Justice Bell left our area, the Meyersdale Republican reported, its passage through Somerset County was like a triumphal procession, thousands of people having turned out to speed it on its journey and to listen to the able advocates of women's suffrage who told the mission of the bell.
Here we are at the Meyersdale Post Office. Back in 1915, when the bell visited town, the post office wasn't yet constructed. This was the site of the Slicer Hotel. As we know, the bell was late in arriving to Meyersdale. Instead of coming to town on Saturday, it didn't make the trip until Monday. And even then, the suffragists had their challenges. It was a rainy day, so the roads were slippery and wet, and it took them a while to get here from Somerset. Keep in mind, a lot of the roads back then, most of them I'm sure, were dirt. They weren't paved. So the bell finally made its way here, and they parked it in front of what was then the Slicer Hotel, now the post office, and it spent a few hours here parked in front of the hotel in Meyersdale. The newspapers report that a large crowd, in spite of the delay, turned out to see the bell. The suffragists accompanying it had lunch while they were in town, and then they made their way on to Berlin. And by about 4:30, the bell found its way to the Lower Diamond, where it spent some time in Berlin. Pennsylvania suffragist Louise Hall spoke there, and then it made its way out of Somerset County and on to Bedford. Of interesting note here in this location in Meyersdale is the fact that that very first women's suffrage meeting here in our community back in March of 1913 was held at the Kendall Building, which is catty-cornered across the street from us, or was. Now today it's simply a church parking lot. But the first meeting was held as I'm looking straight across the street on the corner, and then 2 years later the bell made its way to town and was parked pretty much right here in this spot. If you haven't yet done so but would like to see the original Women's Justice Bell, it is now housed at the Washington Memorial Chapel in Valley Forge. A few years ago, Linda and I had the chance to see the bell, and it was quite the experience after we've learned so much about it. Here we are at another key site in our Meyersdale area suffrage movement. We're in front of what is today the Somerset Trust building here in our community, but in 1915 it was the site of the Second National Bank. And you can see that on the bank building here, the 1909 date and the Second National Bank. This is one of the oldest buildings, community business buildings here in Meyersdale, obviously. And right next door, we have the New Republic office. And when you hear me referring to the Meyersdale Republican newspaper, that actually today is the New Republic. That community newspaper was founded in 1900 as a Meyersdale Republican and still exists today, over 120 years later, as the New Republic. But I chose this site because we've discussed how in 1915 the suffragists were working so hard to see to it that the amendment to the state constitution that was on the ballot that November would be passed, and they would at last be granted the right to vote. So in October 28, 1915, Meyersdale Republican article noted that the rate of suffrage hangs in the balance. Keep in mind, within a week, all of the men here in Somerset County and other communities across our state would be visiting the polls, and they would have the chance to finally give women the vote. So in the week or so leading up to that November 2nd, 1915 vote, Somerset County was a flurry of activity. There were suffrage rallies held in both Meyersdale and Salisbury leading up to the November 2nd vote. Prominent U.S. Senator George W. Norris of Nebraska visited Somerset itself, along with William Jennings Bryan, the former Secretary of State under President Woodrow Wilson. Both of those men spoke in Somerset in the week and few days, really, leading up to the November 2nd vote. It was noted in that Meyersdale Republican newspaper article that our county was, the amendment stood a good chance of passing, and Somerset County is depended upon to do its part in bringing about the victory. So all of the suffragists and the people associated with them here in our area were doing what they could to see that women gained the vote. And it was on that corner right there the Second National Bank building corner at the intersection of Center and Main Streets here in Meyersdale, where, on the evening of November 1st, our Alice Kernan was scheduled to speak and make one final push to convince the men who would be visiting the pools the next morning to give her and her fellow suffragists and all women across the state the vote. Everybody was urged to turn out to hear the last words of the campaign on behalf of suffrage.
Unfortunately, that suffrage amendment on the ballot here in Pennsylvania in November of 1915 did not pass. Though it carried in 33 of the state's 67 counties, it wasn't enough to give women the vote. We discovered this wonderful outline showing the results here in Somerset County based upon municipality in those old Meyersdale commercial newspapers we had preserved. Here in our county, some 36% of the men voted yes, give women the vote, while some 64% voted against doing so. It's difficult to imagine how disappointed Alice, Flora, and all of the other suffragists across Pennsylvania felt when all of the votes were tallied. Yet they did not give up. Perhaps the most fascinating part of this whole story we discovered was that Pennsylvania's state suffragist flag was dedicated right here in Somerset County on July 7, 1916. Linda found this piece that appeared in the Gazette-Times, Pittsburgh's one big newspaper. The newspaper included photographs of the suffrage rally that was held at Alice Kernan's home on that July day, 1916. Some 700 women representing 19 counties gathered at the Kernan home on that day. As the Meyersdale Republican reported, they came in automobiles gaily decorated with the suffragist color of yellow and Votes for Women banners. Nearly 200 cars were parked around the Kernan home, many of them having come more than 100 miles. The newspaper went on to describe the state suffragist flag that was dedicated that summer here in Somerset County. The flag is a keystone on a field of blue surrounded by 11 stars on a field of yellow, the stars representing the 11 states that have already enfranchised women, the newspaper noted. Mrs. Lewis Lawrence Smith of Stratford, Pennsylvania, would be the suffragist who dedicated the flag. She noted, "In our country's flag, we as women have no distinct share, save to follow it with love and loyalty. For the first time in the history of the United States, we have a flag of our own, a woman's flag, to draw us closer and closer as women in the symbol of the woman's movement to help other women and children." She would continue, noting that they also dedicated their suffragist flag to their country and the flag they all served. Mrs. Smith would note, "We believe we offer our government a gift of loyalty and devotion, such as women have never before been able to offer. The service of a great army of women organized in every state and in almost every county. Women trained to work for the common good. Women with the desire to help their country in every possible difficulty and danger. The help that only enfranchised women can give. And so we consecrate ourselves to this task, to pay the last full measure of devotion to secure a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. To this faith, which we for the first time have made possible, we dedicate ourselves anew." We continued researching and came to learn the beautiful home constructed by Alice and her husband Edmund in 1908 and the site of that 1916 suffrage rally still stands today, well over a century later. Back then, the newspapers referred to the home as Swanland Bar, noting it was so named after the home of Edmund's Irish ancestors. It's so fascinating to imagine, all these years later, that some 700 women would travel from 19 different counties of our state to gather right here in Somerset County and dedicate their flag. Local newspapers would report the rally represented the greatest gathering of suffragists ever assembled in Somerset County and one of the most notable assemblages of its kind ever seen in western Pennsylvania. You'll notice Alice is pictured in the bottom rectangular image of this sketch. She was given great accolades by the newspapers for the role she played in organizing the gathering. Yet she humbly gave credit to Somerset County's suffragist organization and the women who were members of that group. It would take 4 more years of work on the part of Somerset County's suffragists, along with suffragists throughout Pennsylvania and many other states, before women in our nation would at last gain the vote. You'll remember I had noted that first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York, was held in the year 1848. It would be 3 decades after that before the women's suffrage amendment would be introduced in Congress. It would be another 4 decades before the amendment would be passed by the U.S. House of Representatives in May of 1919. Several weeks later, the U.S. Senate would pass the amendment, which was then sent to the states for ratification. It would take nearly another year before 35 states would ratify the amendment, just one state shy of the 36 required for ratification. At last, on the 18th of August, 1920, Tennessee would become the final and 36th state necessary to ratify the women's suffrage amendment. On the 26th of August, 1920, that ratification was certified by U.S. Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby. And then, on the 2nd of November, 1920, over 8 million women in the United States would vote in elections for the first time. We can only imagine how Alice, Flora, and all of their friends felt on that 1920 election day.
Here we are at our restored Western Maryland Railway Station Visitor Center and Museum. In the late 1980s, this building was quite the sight, and not in a good way. It looked like it could have been ready to fall down. But there was a very determined group of people here in the Meyersdale area who formed the Meyersdale Area Historical Society and undertook a project, a big project, to preserve this building. And now it's one of the prettiest structures in our town, and it houses our Meyersdale Area Historical Society. The building was built in 1912 when the Western Maryland Railway came through, so it was constructed right about the time or just prior to the beginning of the suffragist movement here in Meyersdale. Today it serves not only as our Historical Society's home, but as a stop along the Great Allegheny Passage hiking and biking trail that runs between Cumberland, Maryland, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Come inside with me and we'll wrap up our suffragist story and tell you just a little more about it and the community project it became. Here we are inside our Historical Society headquarters and Old Western Maryland Railway Station. As you can see, we've put our own replica of the Justice Bell on display here for not only community members to see, but also those who travel the Great Allegheny Passage and stop in to visit us here in Meyersdale. As I mentioned earlier, this historical newspaper preservation project that our library undertook really developed into quite a story. Not only did it lead our library to be able to share a wonderful story that had previously gone really not only untold, but unknown, but it also brought our community together. At one point in the project, Linda suggested that I contact our local high school art department, and I in turn did so, and the instructor out there, Joanne Bolden, jumped right on board, and she got her middle school and high school students, art students involved, and they came up with this beautiful replica of the Women's Justice Bell. So now our community has our very own bell. The students also worked with library volunteers to create paper suffrage flowers. We have our own suffrage garden, as you can see, in the colors of yellow, white, and purple. And we had some young ladies out at the school who did sketch their own portraits of Flora Snyder Black and Alice Kernan for us. So this display was housed at the Historical Society last summer, and again this summer. We hope to find the bell a permanent home in our library. But this project really blossomed, and all thanks to librarian Marguerite Cockley for saving some old newspapers in her garage, her granddaughter Christine for seeing to it the library received those papers, and the community effort to preserve the papers and lead us to this story. Of course, like many other things, in 2020 it hit a snag. We had full intentions of participating in the Pennsylvania Maple Festival Parade in 2020 and creating a float to display our bell, but the Maple Festival didn't happen last year due to the pandemic, but this year it did. And we had a beautiful float in the parade. Our suffragist march that was part of that was scaled back a little bit, but that's okay. Really, in some ways, the pandemic helped us share this story even farther. Without the pandemic, we may never have taken the leap and created this virtual program. So it kind of has forced us to learn something a little new, and in the meantime, give us an avenue for creating a whole new avenue for sharing this wonderful story. I haven't yet had the chance to deliver many presentations on the story as I had planned to do last year, but we are starting to contemplate some local presentations here on the library's behalf to share the story. It's really changed too how I look at my community in a way. Through researching, discovering Alice and Flora, of course we had known about Flora before, being the founder of Pennsylvania Society of Farm Women, but Alice was previously unknown to us. And I almost feel, and I know Linda does too, like we've gotten to know these women. Even though we certainly never had the chance to meet them and a century separates us, we owe them a debt of gratitude, because it's because of women like them, not only the well-known suffragists, and we thank them too, but everyday women here in everyday towns that worked to bring about change for all of us over 100 years later. So now when I walk through my town and walk to work at the library, I look at buildings like the old high school building differently, and the Methodist church and the post office where the Slicer Hotel once stood, and I really do contemplate a lot of times when I walk by those spots what the women of long ago did right here for me and other women of today here in our community. And we owe it all to them, and we also need to remember how important it is as we stand here in our restored Western Maryland Railway Station and our Historical Society headquarters to preserve our history so that such wonderful stories don't go unforgotten and untold.